Well, hello again, everyone. Wanted this first week to give you a short and sweet overview of progressivism, and I've called it progressivism the big picture for a reason. What we are looking at here is, and by 1900, if you've read your chapters, you've done what you're supposed to, you're going to understand there is a seismic shift taking place in America that's going to lead to some changes that we look at today and go, well, why didn't you think of that earlier? But if you go back to the populist party that the book briefly discussed, that man, these are pretty radical for the time. And so what ends up happening is we end up with some very fundamental changes that are taking root at that time. And so let's look at the era itself for a second. Number one, it is in the middle of what we would call a Gilded Age. And that's a name given to it by Mark Twain, if memory serves. Don't hold me to that. But, if something is gilded, it's almost like something's gold plated. It's not going to be worth nearly as much as if it's solid gold. In this period, in so many ways, is like that. It looks so good on the outside. All this standard of living's going up and all these new inventions and all this other stuff and these things and electricity and light bulbs and movies and stuff like that. And we found out, cheaper goods and railroads everywhere, and man, everything's looking great. And what we find out is that underneath, man, people are working zillion hours a week, 6 days a week, working for peanuts. I mean, if you saw the little excerpt about North Carolina, what people would work for, it doesn't look as good underneath when you start digging back the surface. But this progressivism is right smack dab in the middle of it, and it's not going to end until like 1920. All right. And so there's a huge polarity of wealth. I mean, John D. Rockefeller, 500 some odd $1 million he sold Carnegie Steel for. I mean, come on, folks. There is a huge polarity. John Pierpont Morgan had enough money that when the government was running short, he gave them a loan. Can you imagine giving the American government a loan today? I mean, Jeff Bezos can't do that. He can't make it operate for a day with all his money. I mean, I'm sure he could, but you get what I'm saying. There's a huge polarity with that. And if you've ever read the book, The Jungle, you see that hand-to-mouth existence that some of these people, that live in these tenements. And Jacob Riis is talking about how what's going on in the cities, and it's huge. On one hand, you've got people who are literally working themselves to death and almost starving, and then you've got a J.P. Morgan who's got enough money to give the government a loan. So that's a polarity that is massive, like the 1% own more than the 99%. And I'm not sure the accuracy of that number in Reeves, but I think the overall concept is sound. And these men, what were they? Were they captains of industry, or were they robber barons? If we had the first half of this class, that's one of the questions I would ask is, which one are they? Are they, like Commodore George Vanderbilt? I mean, is he a captain of industry? He consolidated the railroads and made a number of innovations? Or is he a robber baron where he says, law, what do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power? I mean, his grandson builds the Biltmore Estate up the road. So you've got men like that, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, and others, Henry Clay Frick that you hear about with the Homestead Steel Strike. You've got these men running around, and they are incredibly wealthy, and they do some good things, but does it justify their position? Don't know. Okay, that's one of those things that what progressivism is designed to answer. And then next, there's that corruption in government. Famous picture, at the money bags of the Senate. The government is basically owned by these guys. They give them so much money, give them so much stock. The government tries to stay out of things. There's almost no regulation whatsoever until the progressive period. So that corruption, whether it is in elections, whether it is in business, is there, and it's staring America in the face for all of the good that comes out of that industrial revolution and gets us to 1900. This corruption in government is going to be one of those lasting stains. And then, again, government controlled by big business, just like it popped in there. Absolutely. So what you've got is that is the underpinning of this era. And a need with a question mark. That's right. What has happened is America, in so many ways, have become an oligarchy. We talk about that today. Well, with this election of 2020, it just needs to get done. But what they're talking about here is, in order to be in this political world, and you had to be wealthy. But not just that. The even wealthier controlled that process. So how does John D. Rockefeller, with his hundreds of millions, if not even more, we're not real sure how much he really had, can he control a government? Yes, yes, he can. He can control state government, and he could have influence in federal government. So America's become that oligarchy, or that rule by a few. And so what happens is these trusts, like the Standard Oil Trust, what was it, 90%, even more of the oil refining capacity in America, they controlled. Carnegie Steel controlled everything from the iron ore mines all the way through the finished product. I mean, it's free enterprise is not there because these monopolies, so to speak, control it all. So you've got free enterprise out the window. Oligarchy, so democracy, truly out the window in so many ways. And so what happens is they're wielding this influence. It is amazing how much power they had. If they wanted you to be snuffed out, you were getting snuffed out. And in the cities, though, there's this little vacuum down at a much lower level where you have a lot of voter fraud and political machines, where, the services that we take for granted today didn't exist. But these political machines or bosses provided it. And this is going to permeate American politics up until the 30s and 40s. Even Harry Truman from out in Kansas City was known as the senator from Pendergast for the Pendergast machine that he was supposedly part of, or they put him into office. So that voter fraud said, listen, and there's not strength in voting, so there was strength in counting. You can make all these things happen. So you've got a democracy, or a republic, more correct term, that is not working for whom it is designed to work. It is working for big business and the wealthy. So boom, that's going to cause a... And so what are these origins of this progressives, though? Where do they come from? They begin with people that are critical of American society from the top to the bottom. Socialist. I mean, that seems to be a hot button term today. But there were socialists in America, though not very many. But there were a lot of populists. And there were union workers. And these people are critical of what America had become. And so what happens is the populists bring a lot of the issues to the forefront. I mean, things that you would never even think about dealing with farmers. But so what happens is they begin to morph. They're a very fertile ground, or a nice home for people that are going to become progressives, this reforming influence. And so what they want at the end of it is the government needs to cure society's ills because nothing else has the power. Prior to this period, the federal government was relatively weak. Of course, it could declare and fight wars. They were really good at that. Oh, it could kick Native Americans off the land. We were pretty good at that too. But otherwise, you're talking a day before there was any income tax. They got their money by the few tariffs that were implemented by selling land. It is a lean, mean government machine at that time. And what the progressives want is that thing to expand and to cure society's problems. A laudable thought process, though we're going to see it doesn't quite work out the way they want to. And lastly, they want to move from laissez-faire that your book talked about a good bit, that hands-off approach. It really wasn't hands-off, but whatever, to a much more paternalistic government that's going to really not bear that kind of fruit until Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal in 1933. But this is what the progressives want at that time. Social problems, so to speak. Well, you got working conditions that are unsafe. If I have somebody in my building who slips and falls on a wet floor and hurts themselves, it's on, okay? Back in those days, they said you could tell how long a man had worked in a steel mill by how many fingers he had left. And that wasn't just true at the turn of the century. That was true in the 1960s when my own father-in-law, who worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, was there. So these are unsafe. People dying left and right. Railroads in particular were a deadly job. Mines, oh my goodness, those things are unsafe. And so that's a problem. Today we wouldn't even begin to think about putting up with it, but back then it was an issue. Child labor is another one. I mean, when we call and we send out one call, say, hey, get your kids to school. And if kids don't come to school enough days, all of a sudden we go to truancy court. Back then, these robber barons figured out such a way that you could pay people just enough money that they had to have their children to work to make ends meet. And so children, instead of being in school, they were working in factories and mines, all kinds of places. I cannot imagine it. But child labor was one of those issues. And finally, it comes to the front. Unsafe food and medicine. I always laugh. People say, hey, man, you need to eat green stuff. You need to eat salads, you eat vegetables. And I'm always like, man, vegetables have recalls. E. coli, pesticides. I said, they never recall bacon. But the point of it is that at that time, food and medicine were unsafe. I mean, you would have cures for headaches that had cocaine in them. I mean, then I'm like, okay, well, there you go. Food's being like that too. Oh my goodness, today we wouldn't put up with it, but back then it was. And Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, really shines a light on that. Part of the muckrakers of that progressive period who wanted people to know these are problems, okay? And progressives know they are and set out to fix them. Then you had immigration issues. Immigration had always been a big deal in American history. At first, it was Western Europe. It was your England, your France, your whatnot, your Ireland, and the Irish were considered to be the lowest rung on the ladder. But what happens is even the Germans, but what happens by the end of the 19th and early 20th century, that thing has shifted, and you have Southern and Eastern Europeans. You have people with names that have more, that don't have enough vowels in them. And I'm not saying it to be mean, because this old redneck boy can't pronounce them. My wife is from Pittsburgh, where they have definite ethnic enclaves, and it to me is just so neat because you can see that ethnicity. My mother-in-law, or my stepmother-in-law, is of Polish descent. I'm like, well, man, you don't get a lot of that in North Carolina, but those were issues because the vast majority of them spoke English only as a second language. They lived in very ethnically isolated enclaves around people that are, spoke the same language from the same region, maybe even have the same religion. So it's just natural for that to take place. But all of a sudden they're considered different and, quote, weird. And, hey, they're coming in and they're changing things. They're bringing crazy ideas and they're funny looking and their food's different. And it creates problems because America's supposed to be this melting pot, this assimilation. And all of a sudden you've got people, there's enough of them that there's a critical mass that assimilation is not taking place. Now, does that sound like today? Absolutely. It's not the first time America's had that problem today. All right, so you've got immigration issues that we've got to fix. That stratification of society, there's a definite elite rich and there's a definite abject poor and all kinds of gradations in between. And it depends on where you are, where you're born, depends on where you're going to go in mathematical terms. So you've got that stratification going on, and there's a lack of, and the education's relatively poor. Now, I know your book spent a lot of time talking about all these new education things, blah, 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 new schools and medicine and this, that, and the other, University of Chicago over here, and Johns Hopkins over there. But if you were a regular person living in a tenement in New York City, that didn't happen. This lack of and poor education is an issue, and the progressives are going to set out to fix it. Ideas. Well, number one, like I said, we've got an extension of the old Jacksonians, and some historians may argue with that, but I'm not going to, because the Jacksonians wanted to make the country work for the people, and at least that's what Andrew Jackson said. And so what happens here is progressives want the government to work for the people. So they consider themselves to be Jacksonian in nature. Then the next thing, increased democracy. The cure for society's ills is more democracy. 1900, ladies, you couldn't vote. That doesn't happen until 1920. My own grandmother was alive before women could vote. That senators were appointed by state legislatures. All these things happened. 18-year-olds could not vote. All that stuff has happened in the American 20th century. So this increased democracy, okay, this is what's going to come. This is part of that progressive idea. People need to have that say. And there you go, another Jacksonian idea, giving more power to the common person. Absolutely. Take it away from the politicians, take it away from the oligarchies, take it away from the wealthy, and give it to the common person. That is going to be another consistent theme. And I think right there, I think we've made that point that government works for the people and not for big business. But look at this last one. I'm going to create an environment, okay, in which everyone had a chance to succeed and prosper. That's not the outcome. We're not guaranteeing an outcome. They wanted to create an environment in which you could do that. I'm going to imagine none of us sitting here listening to this got a real problem with any of that. To us, that it's what Abraham Lincoln said in Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. You see it here in the progressives. In the last slide, their plan. What are they going to do? Well, again, to beat that horse because it's already dead, bring the power back to the people. And you're going to see it. Referendum, initiative, recall, direct election of senators. Man, it is going to be something else. And you're going to see this across a number of presidents. And it's really going to finish bearing its fruit in the New Deal of the 1930s. And so what we get is this idea that the cure for democracy is ill. is more democracy. And that is the essence of progressivism right there. And all right, I hope you have fun reading your book, and we'll see you next week.